Welcome to Between the Reads, where we shine a spotlight on some of the most talented Black authors in the industry to discuss their works of fiction and the inspirations behind them. Each episode will dive into the rich and diverse world of literature, exploring everything from historical fiction to romance and speculative fiction to YA and beyond. Tune in as we celebrate the voices of Black authors and the power of storytelling. Are you ready, Booze and Bros? Then sit back, relax, and let's get to it. Kai Thomas is a writer, carpenter, and land steward. He is Afro-Canadian, born and raised in Ottawa, descended from Trinidad and the British Isles. In the Upper Country is his first novel, and I think that's the shortest bio I've ever read on the show. Kai, welcome to Between the Reads.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, bios, I like to keep it short and sweet.
Very short and sweet.
To save the long form for the conversations like this.
Right. So tell our readers what In the Upper Country is all about.
Sure. In the Upper Country is a historical fiction that hones in on mid-19th century kind of Great Lakes region, a number of different sites, but the principal site is a fictionalized town called Dunmore, which I imagined as one of the hubs of the Underground Railroad, one of the terminus stopping points of the Underground Railroad during the period of time that Canada kind of became the most important destination for enslaved peoples fleeing enslavement. And the novel follows the protagonist, whose name is Lucinda Martin, who is a young woman of many talents. She's a journalist, she's a housekeeper, she's a healer, she does a whole bunch of things, but she is called and summoned rather to collect testimony from an old woman who is in jail for shooting a slave hunter. And it's their exchange of tales, of stories, that forms the narrative structure of the novel. So that is how I would explain it in a minute or so.
That's your pitch.
That's the pitch. Yeah, it's gone through many different iterations.
The pitch, I think the pitch is harder to write than the book itself.
In some ways, yeah.
Yeah. Because you're trying to take this whole story and just condense it into this paragraph or two to sell it to people. I think, like I said, I'd rather write a book than a pitch.
I agree. I think you really hit it in that, because it's like the beauty of the book is that it doesn't have to fit in a tight package that may or may not be appealing to a modern readership. It just is, and then we kind of have to force it into that. And it's a good exercise. I think it's a good challenge. It's a good constraint to try and work on that, but it's not what it wants to be. Right.
I always feel like it's like when you're trying to pack for a trip and you have to take all these clothes, but your suitcase isn't big enough, so you cram everything down into the suitcase. I feel like that's what you try to do when you write when you're writing a pitch. It drives me crazy.
That's a good metaphor.
Yeah. So what inspired you to write In the Upper Country, and what research was involved in the process?
Yeah, I was inspired to write this novel, I guess. Well, one point that I can kind of identify along the journey was coming across this photo of a man named John Daddy Hall. And I came across this photo and then read about the little that I could find about his history. Much of the history that's been written, he's kind of a fringe figure. He doesn't really show up in a lot of the history books, although his story is really spectacular. A lot of the work that's been done on him is by a community historian named Peter Myler, who was a great help to me during the research process of writing the book. But anyways, I came across this photo and read that John Daddy Hall was a man of indigenous as well as African descent. And he was born in Canada, or what is now known as Canada, who
Mm-hmm.
was a veteran of the War of 1812, which I thought, the more I read about it, was this really interesting moment that I hadn't heard much about
Mm-hmm.
before, um, that really exemplified a number of different interesting political dynamics that, especially for Black and Indigenous peoples. And so John Daddy Hall was involved in that, was enslaved, survived decades of enslavement
Mm-hmm.
in probably Kentucky, and escaped by like swimming across the Ohio River. Had this journey northward where he became one of the founding members of the Black community of a town now known as Owen Sound
Mm-hmm.
in Ontario, and he was the town crier.
Mm-hmm.
And he served as a town crier for many years. He was kind of this very celebrated figure in this small town. To this day, actually, they have an Emancipation Day festival every year, and he's
Yeah,
kind
and
of
you said he
celebrated.
lived to like 115 in the back of your book, right?
Yeah, yeah, he lived this extraordinarily long life, which is this other kind of cool uh, tangent of history that I went down. Is just
Mm-hmm.
reading about all these people off, reading. It's not that everybody was living that long. I think on average, humanity was not living that long, but
Mm-hmm.
there was just these outliers, and in particular, I came across a number of uh, people who survived enslavement who just lived these incredibly long lives, and I just found that interesting too, and started thinking about the resilience and the tenacity that comes with the experiences that these ancestors were having at this moment in time, this
Mm-hmm.
period of time. So I read about John Daddy Hall and all of these elements of his life that I found really interesting and intriguing, and moreover that I hadn't seen represented in film or in literature.
Mm-hmm.
So I was, interested in creative writing myself, although I hadn't done much of it or been trained, and ended up seeking out some opportunities to learn, and the most kind of central of which was a MFA program in creative writing in the University of Guelph.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a 2-year program that was really good for me. It connected me to not only peers, but a lot of great professors and mentors, many of whom really influenced me as a writer and really gave me good feedback and workshopping opportunities for this manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
And just kept working on it for about a year or so after. Ended up getting an agent, and anyways, I'm kind of going into like more of the publishing side of things,
Right,
or
right,
the,
right.
the actual writing. But all that to say, it's kind of interesting because given that this is my debut, it's
Right.
like the story of writing this book is also the story of me becoming an author.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why I started drifting in that
Right,
direction.
but I mean the research that you had to do for this, I imagine you probably went down quite a few rabbit holes while you were
Yes,
doing the
thank you
research.
for reminding me of that element of the research. So yeah, started off with a lot of books,
Mm-hmm.
and there were some of the more kind of the less mainstream publications, such as the work that's the community historian kind of
Mm-hmm.
work, such as what Peter Myler has put out, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and went from there to a number of different books, just historical monographs that
Mm-hmm.
are really well written and deal with. I think what I found was, even though all of the elements of the story of John Daddy Hall, for example, that I was interested in and hadn't seen represented in literature, they
Mm-hmm.
were represented. There was a lot, not a lot, but there's enough written about them in history books,
Mm-hmm.
such as the historian Taya Miles, who recently won a National Book Award for her latest book. She had a book prior to that called The Dawn of Detroit that talks
Mm-hmm.
all about Black and Indigenous and
I
European.
think I have her book. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so her, a number of other scholars who have written uh, just really cool histories that deal with 19th century Black Indigenous relationships, the different political moments,
Mm-hmm.
Underground Railroad, Cheryl Jennifer LaRoche has a book called The Geography of Resistance, all about these little known aspects of the Underground Railroad. And she's one of the scholars who's like kind of redefining that term as not just about the abolitionists, but it's about this movement of Black people seeking freedom across these continents. So people like that. So I just delved into their books and tried to really read closely the elements that had piqued my interest, or the specific historical moments that I wanted to represent in this book in fiction. And then from there, just looked a bit more closely at their bibliographies and saw what kind of primary source documents they were dealing with. So everything from court records to census records to newspaper ads, runaway slave ads in Canadian newspapers, which is like a little known avenue, but really fascinating to see all of the legacy of Canadian slavery represented in that way. And from there, just got into contact with some people, some elders, some knowledge holders, people of different communities who would have been, who are concerned in the book or who are featured in the book, and just spoke with people, not as like research per se, but just more as kind of informal conversations to get a sense of, how are people who are alive today holding stories of this time, and how can I let that seep into the creative process in whatever way it can. So I'd say that's pretty much what the research and the kind of investigation, I guess, was like. And I took a trip to Trinidad actually at one point, partly because I was interested in my own ancestry, but also I found out that two of our lineages from Trinidad are descended from veterans of the War of 1812.
Oh, wow.
Which I didn't even know when I started writing the book, and I just thought, I just felt called to find out more about that and about that community, which is still alive and well, just not, my part of the family just didn't keep that oral history with us. That's where we came from. That's where a number of our ancestors came from. So we actually, it wasn't just straight from Africa to Trinidad. It was to the Carolinas and Virginia, Chesapeake Bay area, then probably to somewhere in Canada, and then to Trinidad, granted land by the British. So I talked to a number of people who hold that history and are leaders of that community, and just let it kind of take
it sounds like there's just like tentacles. You would uncover one thing, and that led to something else, and that leads to something else, and that leads to something else. It's very interesting. Yeah. So in the back of the book, you stated that you began to understand your identity as not only an inheritance of enslavement, but first and foremost of the theft of African people's connection to the land and the theft of their indigeneity. So let's unpack that a little more. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. I think I wrote that in thinking about, the legacy and the historical realities of Black and Indigenous peoples on this land. And just in thinking about why it's an important topic to represent in literature. In my own life, I had found that my trajectory, I guess, over the past 15 years, I guess kind of since I left my parents' house as a teenager to now, has very much been focused on trying to connect with the land and learn the skills necessary to have a land-based lifestyle, both as a just like personal interest, as well as, especially as a young man, I just felt more and more unsafe in the urban environments. And as I encountered things like racial profiling by police and stuff like that, I found myself really seeking out nature as a place of sanctuary and healing, and both in my work and in kind of my leisure time. So that's just been my story, and along the way, I've had a number of really impactful experiences with Indigenous friends and just people who have welcomed me to that process in very meaningful ways for me.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what got me thinking. And, I just had a number of these conversations. I remember talking, for example, with a boy who's the grandson of a woman I was visiting out in Six Nations, which is Haudenosaunee territory in Southern Ontario. And I was speaking to this little boy, and he was showing me like he had set up like a punching bag out in the woods, and he was like showing me, and we were like punching the bag and talking and whatever.
Uh-huh.
And and I could tell because he was so young, he didn't understand what my racial background was.
Okay.
And to him, he just knew that if you were dark skinned, you were probably Indigenous, and if you were white, then you were white. And that was like his reality. So he was talking to me, and at a certain moment, it became clear to me that like he thought I was indigenous to Turtle Island. He thought I was
okay.
So he was talking about like, well, where obviously you're native. Where are you native to? Mm-hmm. And I said I don't really. I guess Africa, but it's kind of complicated, because I was just struggling to explain it to him, and he's like, it's okay. He's like, he's like, as long as you know where you're native to, that's what's important.
Right.
And he was just trying to reassure me. So it's conversations like that just kind of got me thinking about, okay, it's true that our legacy as people of African descent is really defined by, in some really important ways, by this theft of indigeneity, this theft of being able to a certain extent, being able to claim a homeland or that sense of connection to place that is ancestral in that way. And so, I just started thinking about, what other conversations have happened like that, and what other political alliances have happened like that throughout history. And I think there is a lot more that has been written and thought about in locations where the population of Blacks and Indigenous peoples have just been high enough to have communities arise, like the Seminoles of Florida or the Garifuna of Belize and the Grenadines. And there are different places, especially in the South, where that's just normal, where people are having these conversations, and the history and the amount of people who have lived and experienced those sorts of alliances and kind of syncretic traditions, and it's just a shared understanding that just because we as Black folks are on this side of the ocean doesn't mean that we have completely lost that connection, that there are really foundational and defining ways that we can identify ourselves to continue to nourish that really important connection to land that is important for all sorts of different reasons, not only health, but political sovereignty and all these things. But in Canada in particular, the conversation around that is not so as present, I think, in part because there's just never been that many Black people in Canada, so that the critical mass to have those conversations hasn't really happened. But the instances of Black and Indigenous encounters have happened, and that is what I was trying to get at, I guess.
So is that what made you want to explore and write a story about Black and Indigenous relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, conversations like that, and just thinking about it, and wanted to pay homage in a sense and represent a history and a shared history to a certain extent that that I haven't seen represented. I haven't seen people talk about. I think it's starting to come a little bit more. I'm starting to read different different books and certainly listen to conversations where people are talking about stuff like that. But to really see it in a book and hopefully on screen someday, where we can really see, this happened. This part of the world, it wasn't all about colonial domination. It was a lot more nuanced than that, and our ancestors of various origins were having really interesting conversations and having really important and meaningful interactions with each other.
So you tackle some subjects that, to my knowledge, haven't been written about a whole lot. So Black Native alliances, indigenous sovereignty, the Underground Railroad, and the politics of free Black settlement, to put it in your words from the back of the book. And yet the book was not like this information overload about these important topics. How did you weave all of these different aspects into the world of your characters without it becoming too much of like an expository dump?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question. I feel like, especially as I've started talking about it, I feel like the political topic and the identity oriented topics tend to be what I end up talking about, especially in the news kind of outlet sort of things. That tends to be what they're most interested in. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's a novel and it's a story that has to flow and can't be all about exposition and historical details.
Right.
And at the end of the day, as much as these themes and more abstract ideas sparked the book or got me started and got me thinking about things, at the end of the day, the characters still have to live and breathe and be true and and not be dumping a whole bunch of history at you trying to read a novel. So yeah, I think how I balanced that was just, I think a lot of it gets worked out or a lot of it for me got worked out in the rewriting and in the editing process. I think my tendency was to, in the early drafts, to just like, let me put everything in there in terms of all the things I'm reading about. And then you read back over it, or you get feedback, or I got feedback to read of people reading back over it. And you get to, smooth out all of the details that don't need to be there for the story, that can just, it can feel like a loss to like lose, I really wanted people to know about this fact or this element of 19th century material culture or this political figure. And what you really find is like, even just having done that research as an author, even if it doesn't end up in the book in a direct way, it still contributes to the world building in a way.
Right.
It can still be felt that like, even though all the details aren't in there, and at the end of the day, really just trying to focus on representing these characters' experiences in the moment to moment, and in all of the particular ways that fiction that can make for compelling fiction. What did things smell like? What did it feel like? What was the emotional experience? What did it look like? All of the sensory kind of elements that can make a moment come alive.
So throughout the book, the land is always present. There's these beautiful descriptions of the land at night, in the winter, in the summer. And it's almost as if the land is a character in the book, to me. Why did you choose to keep the land at the forefront of the novel?
Yeah, I think, honestly, probably first and foremost, because I spend a lot of time out on the land, and it can, it inspires a lot of my desire to write.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not like a big, everybody's always trying to get me to take pictures, and I'm just like,
It's
I
not your
don't,
thing.
yeah, no, I'd rather try and, write about it and
Mm-hmm.
try and capture something. Because yeah, and so, so that's part of it, is just personal interest, and that's just where I am. And so it makes sense that it shows up in a big way in the novel from
Okay.
that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess another way of thinking about it would be to, I think, like, if if it is true that books can inspire people, I think first and foremost what I would love for people to be inspired by in reading the book is to go outside and to rekindle or kindle or whatever our connection, your connection, the reader's connection to the natural world. Because as much as I love books, I think that's a really important thing for us to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
At this moment in time, is just remember that we come from this earth, and we gotta we gotta take care of it, and we gotta learn to appreciate it. You protect what you love, right? And so
Absolutely.
I think that's a hidden agenda
Mm-hmm.
in the book for sure. It's just like, let me shout out the land and all of its majesty and
Right.
beauty and all of the rest, so that hopefully a reader can be reminded and maybe inspired to
Right.
connect with it in that way.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you remember, I spoke to you in the email. I've been growing my own food for about 16 years now. So,
Amazing.
yeah. So and actually I know about Leah Penniman, and I know you work with her, and,
Yeah.
so, I mean, I was a fan of Leah Penniman long before I had a podcast. So it was just like when you said you worked with her, I was like, oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, like being out there is nothing. I cannot wait for it to get warm, because there's nothing like being out under the sun, getting your hands in the soil, growing food, watching these plants go from little seeds to these big monstrous things that have all these fruits and vegetables. And, there's nothing like a fresh tomato from the garden,
Yeah.
with some mozzarella and some fresh basil from your garden and drizzled with olive oil. It's just,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. No, I love that. Where about are you based?
I'm in Maryland. I'm actually in the Chesapeake Bay area. So when I was reading in your book about that, I was like, oh, wow. Okay. I always love to see, reference. I mean, I was born and raised in Jersey, but I've been here for 24 years now. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And 16 years of growing your own food. That's amazing.
Yeah, that actually started from a question that I asked my kids, who are now grown, but they were toddlers, and we were in the grocery store. And I said, you know where an apple comes from? And they said, right there, Mommy. And I said, no, we got to change that. And so from that, I just started a little garden just as a project to show them where food comes from. And it turned into this passion, and some stuff that I just knew how to do naturally. And that came from, watching my grandparents growing up. My grandmother had a farm in Minnesota, and my grandfather in South Carolina, he grew food. And, so a lot of that stuff just kind of came back to me, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, so, yeah.
That's
getting
amazing.
outside. Yeah, getting outside is I definitely wanted to do it reading this book, talking about the fires and them sitting around and eating fish and things like that. It just... yeah, I definitely wanted to get out. When I was reading the book, I was like, I cannot wait for it to get warm again.
Nice. Oh, yeah. I'm so glad. Glad. Yeah, absolutely. No, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Your story. So now, speaking of stories, there are lots of stories in this book. Stories that connect the characters to the land.
Right.
the exchange of stories between the old woman and Lucinda is kind of the central aspect of this
Yep.
book. So how did you approach crafting these stories that were shared, and what was your goal in creating those stories?
Yeah, I've always appreciated and enjoyed reading uh, a polyphonic narrative, a narrative that's like a chorus of voices.
Mm-hmm.
It's the type of literature that when it's done well, I personally really appreciate and I really like reading.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it felt natural to approach the story in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, just because I enjoyed it more. I enjoyed it the writing of it more, and also I think because the book is so thematic and kind of interested in broad themes and in tying
Mm-hmm.
together a few different moments in
Mm-hmm.
history, it also made sense to approach it in that way where I wasn't bound by following a single narrator or protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of crafting that, yeah, again, I would say like I just let it start as messy as it came out.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of the early drafts of the manuscript, it was just very fragmented.
Mm-hmm.
And, um, I didn't have the connecting threads. And in fact, I didn't even truly consider Lucinda to have been the protagonist
Mm-hmm.
until relatively late in the writing process,
Okay.
and it was at some point that one of my various readers or editors, I don't remember who, was just like, okay, you need somebody to like ground the these fragments and
Mm-hmm.
bring us through, and so it was helpful for me to think about it in that sense. And what I ended up doing was conceptualizing the book as really grounded in, I guess, these 5 days of
Mm-hmm.
Lucinda's life.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of the stories that come in that are not from her voice are either people who she's listening to
Mm-hmm.
in the kind of present moment of the novel,
Mm-hmm.
or people who she's reading,
Mm-hmm.
or yeah, I think that's it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really, I think, it still makes for a complex structure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as you were mentioning at the beginning, like needing to go back to it. And I think
Yeah.
from what I'm hearing, the people who are enjoying it the most are the ones who are reading it slowly and like taking the time, because I am asking perhaps more than most from the reader to, it's not the type of book that is going to kind of cradle you along a journey and you're always
Mm-hmm.
going to know where you are and who, your frames of reference are. You do
Mm-hmm.
need to pay attention to the changes and shifts.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yes.
and at the same time, there is, like, the structure is there. And so if you do pay attention, you won't be lost, because you'll be following Lucinda along these days of her life as she
Right.
like
Yeah.
encounters these. So yeah, that conceptualizing, getting to that point where I could say, okay, this is what it is. We're following Lucinda. She's getting these different voices in her
Mm-hmm.
experience, and that's that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. I read it over about a week and a half, but I still just want to go back because it's so rich. There's just so much. Like, I kept stopping because I was looking up things that were mentioned, and it was like, oh, wait a minute. And then, so I'm writing things down and trying to find books on the topic. So now that I've gone through the first time, I just want to go back now and just read
Right.
without taking notes and all of that, because there was just so much to unpack. And I'm always just a curious creature, so I'm
Sure.
stopping, and kind of pulls me out of the story when I stop to go and write something
Yeah.
down. So then I have to go back and say, okay, let me, so now I want to go back through and just read it, just to read the story. And
Yeah.
I think that way it'll come alive even more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that. Thank you for having the patience to
Oh,
revisit it.
yeah. I mean, it's just like I said, there's just so much in it that, I'm fascinated by slavery. I have a lot of books about slavery, about the Civil War, because it just is the sheer resilience and the will of people who were enslaved to survive so that you and I could be here.
Yeah.
It's almost like, people say, oh, I don't want to read about that. Slavery is done and it's too traumatic. Well, for me, I feel like I'm honoring them by continuing to learn about this topic. So when I see things like, the Black Canadian thing, that's something that for me, Canada was that place where you stopped, for the Underground Railroad, and you're showing so much more, which is something that I'm going to ask you about in a little bit. But it was such a rich novel for me. So, I really want to stop and take it back in again. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate that.
So, without giving too much away, just tell us a little bit about Lucinda Martin and how she evolves throughout the novel.
Yeah, she was a really interesting character because in writing her, like I mentioned, I didn't know that she was going to be the protagonist until relatively late. And she really just demanded that space at the end of the day. It was less of a choice and more of just like, well, I guess she
was speaking. She was like, this is my story.
Yeah. So, I mean, her character is very jaded in some ways. She's a young woman, and so in some ways, her character is defined by that youth, but she's also very resilient and very autonomous and dedicated to that autonomy in a time where it would have been even more difficult than it is today for a young Black woman to do so. So she really exhibits some headstrongness, from that.
Right.
And the novel, as it kind of evolves, is really following the I guess a type of emotional evolution of her character as she experiences, her triggers and learns to live her truth, basically, and learns to tell her own story and not be afraid of that. So that was that's one way, I guess, to think about her character and her character's journey in the novel.
Yeah, and she also I like how you had the reader see about 3/4 of the way through, because she has this little voice that kind of talks to her. But then about 3/4 of the way through the book, she reads this article, and I like how you have the reader see that she realizes that she's found her voice by writing this article. I thought that was so important. It's because, when we find our voice, that's really our truth. And then when we're able to find that, then the world opens up, and I loved that scene where she's like, oh, this is my voice.
Right.
That was really meaningful.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
it's a writer's journey in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. As an author, I've written a book and I'm toying with writing another one, but that's a big thing for people who write, is finding your voice, and I think it's not something that comes with the first book. At least it didn't for me. I sort of found it, but as I continue to write, I'm continuing to find it, but it hasn't completely solidified yet. And I think that's a big journey for writers, is finding that voice.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great. I really appreciate the question, because it's not something that I've had the chance to talk about with somebody else, and so it's got me thinking about. It's kind of Cinder's journey is in some ways the writer's journey, and it kind of runs parallel with, this journey of her as not just as a writer, but as a person, being able to, how do you find your voice on the page, but also how do you find your voice, your oral voice?
Yes, in the world.
Yeah, both in terms of speaking your truth, but also, yet reconciling your truth and being able to claim it and not be worried about what other people think about that. So in some ways, that's also what she's going through in that moment in her life. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Yep. So how does Lucinda's work as a journalist play into the larger story? And what commentary does that offer, in your opinion, on the role of journalism in society?
It's an interesting question. I was interested in exploring that because I was learning a bit about the different Black publications that were emerging at the time. And it's difficult. It's an interesting question, but it's difficult to kind of point to in part because from what I learned about journalism at the time, is kind of a different thing than what we know of today as journalism, or at least what we expect from journalism today. So the journalistic standards that are now really important to journalism was not something that wasn't really a thing back then.
Right.
Well, you're supposed to tell the truth, but also is more in the style of writing, where a lot of the periodicals that I looked over, are very dominated not only by advertising, but by like polemical stuff too. Very opinion oriented, very didactic. A lot of times it kind of read a lot more like propaganda than what we would recognize as journalism.
Right.
And I wasn't like, that element of it wasn't something that I was interested in exploring, or not that I wasn't interested in exploring, but it wasn't like, it wasn't a major focus of the novel of like what the journalism in this era would have been about. But it was noted,
right.
as like, this is not what a modern person would expect a newspaper to be. That said, I think there is this element of how important it is rather to to engage in that sphere as a community, I guess, and especially how important it would have been at that moment for a kind of newly literate Black community to express themselves in that way and to be heard in that way, regardless of the style of journalism. It's like they were pushing it out there. There's a lot of really productive publications, and what a statement at a moment where not so far away, somebody could be killed or worse for doing something like that. So yeah, I don't think that's a complete answer to your question, because like I said, I'm still kind of thinking through what it means given how different the institutions of journalism were at that time. But I'm gonna keep thinking about that, because I think, you're encouraging me to think about how to tie it to this present moment and to that topic in this present moment in a way I haven't really considered before.
Yeah, I just asked because I do read a lot of things from 18th and 19th century history, and the journalism of that time, like you said, it's not like it is today, and a lot of it is propaganda, because you would have stories that were written from a white perspective, even about something like lynching, and it would always be like, the white person was the victim and being attacked, and so this monster of a black person had to be lynched. But when you read the black papers about the same thing, it was a totally different thing. Right. The truth was actually there of what happened. And so it's just always interesting to see that disparity of journalism that was happening at that time, really even before there was, like you said, journalistic ethics, developed. This was just people writing papers, and, that was it. They were writing from their perspectives, and how it's changed over time. But she was writing this story because people were urging her to tell this woman's side of the story, because she's being held in this jail and getting ready to be lynched for, killing a slave trader. Yeah. So it's just, I just wanted to get your perspective on that.
Well, it's interesting. Thanks for expounding a little bit, but it's making me think about how, we have these journalistic standards today, but that's such a huge conversation in today of like, how does that actually manifest? And certainly the way that journalistic standards are viewed from various points of the political spectrum is not to be taken for granted, right? Everybody is looking at the other side of the spectrum as fake news, and so in some ways, maybe it's not that different at all. It's just we have the pretense that it should be different. Right. But really, it's like people telling their stories with their own agendas, and that's what it was there, without the expectation that it would have been anything different. Right. So it's making me think of those scenes and those moments like through the lens of social media, because maybe that's how to think about it, through this lens of like anything goes, and everybody has a voice, and we just have to. It's our job as listeners or as readers to kind of sort through the clamor and get to the
crux of the issue. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So now stories, especially within the African American community, we have griots in Africa, and a lot of our history has been passed down through the spoken word, because we weren't allowed to read or write, and then, so that created a generation of, illiteracy among us. So the only way that we had, for a lot of us, was to pass these stories down orally. So you have this woman in the jail, and I'm not going to say her name because I want people to figure out who she is and all of that on their own. But she's about to be hanged, and that's not her concern. Her concern is sharing stories with Lucinda. Why have her reveal all the things that she revealed through stories instead of just telling her flat out, like, this is who I am?
Right. I was the concept for that premise of having the two of them speak in that way came from a few different stories or histories that I was reading about. Definitely, prison literature and kind of the epistolary form and the so-called runaway slave narratives was a big influence. But the most kind of salient influence for that setup came when I read Barracoon.
That was such a good book.
Yeah. And it just felt like, because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that was only published a few years ago.
Yeah. It had been written a long time ago, obviously, but somehow got buried and someone found it and published it. And
so I got to read this gem, from nearly 100 years prior of Zora Neale Hurston doing her thing. And the thing that was so cool about that was, in a lot of the runaway slave narratives, so-called runaway slave narratives, what you find is an attempt to create the illusion that you're hearing this person's words verbatim. Right. And that may or may not have been true. but it's just you just don't know because what's concealed is the apparatus of their interlocutor and whoever's asking them the questions, and not to mention the editor and the people who are compiling the thing. So with Zora Neale Hurston, she's talking to Cudjoe Lewis, one of the survivors of the last black cargo, so called. So this man he has memory of life in Africa. He has memory of his village being raided by the Homie female warriors, which was just wild to read about. He has memory of passage. He has memory of being enslaved. He has memory of freedom. So he just got all of this wealth, and this as a reader as you begin the book. But what Zora Neale Hurston does is she, instead of just giving you the transcript or her edited version, she tells you about how she had to build a relationship with this man.
Yes.
In order for him to
trust her.
And I was like, that makes so much sense. Because from what I know of the people in my life or in my lineage or, my grandparents or whatever, when I talk to people about a traumatic experience, they're not just, there's so few people are going to just up and tell you, yeah, this is exactly what happened to me. This is this. And it makes a lot of sense that you have to relationship build in order to get there. And, in Barracoon, from my recollection, it wasn't necessarily that they were trading stories, but that was how I creatively adapted the concept of like, let's relationship build and let's get to know each other. And I think it was important. It felt important once I started doing that because it seemed as though that was an appropriate way to honor both the gravity of the subject matter and to like really humanize this dynamic of I'm going to ask a person about something that is probably very difficult for them to recall or talk about, something that was very difficult for them to live through, certainly. And let's think about that and think about the responsibility of the interviewer in that dynamic. So that's how that came about.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that we see characters go through in this novel is the various ways that they're forcefully removed from the land. With Africans, they're kidnapped, they're brought to a new continent. Then you have the indigenous people who are forcefully, pushed from their land. People are trying to take their land from them. And even though the ways that they're removed from the land are different, it still shows a commonality of suffrage. So why did you want to show that common experience between indigenous people and Africans?
Yeah, I think as I learned about those periods of history, I was struck by how much similarity there was. For example, especially in Canada, but in the U.S. to a certain degree, indigenous people were also enslaved. So it wasn't just that they were being pushed from their land or they were having their lands expropriated, but they were literally undergoing the same experience that black people were. The only difference was they weren't being transported across the ocean. They were just being transported across land. But there are these terms that emerged, for example, or one that I use in the book.
Buckra.
Buckra. Yeah, that's it. But I'm thinking of the term pani.
Okay.
Yes. So that was a term that was used in New France.
Okay.
Quebec, modern day Quebec, to describe an indigenous person who was enslaved. It was kind of bastardized from an actual ethnic group, the Pawnee.
Okay.
But that's what it referred to. And so it's like you had the exact same phenomenon, whereas where Africans were being called Coromantee or Igbo or kind of indiscriminately, they were being grouped into these categories. The same thing was happening to indigenous people. They were being stripped and transported and enslaved. And so I was struck by like, okay, well, I didn't know that. And so what does that mean? What is what is the real difference in terms of the experiences? And I don't mean to say that there is no real difference. I think there are a lot of differences, but perhaps not as many as we are taught to think about, and perhaps perhaps the reasons why we're taught to think that our experiences are so distinct have more to do with this legacy of divide and conquer from a colonial perspective. Keep oppressed people apart and thinking they have nothing to do with each other, and that way we can exploit those differences through recruiting, black folks as buffalo soldiers or indigenous people as slave hunters or whatever. And so I was just interested in that, and I was struck by the fact that I couldn't think of a single book or story that really got into that, that truly examined that in more than a kind of tokenistic way, where it's like, this is a movie about black people, and we're going to throw in an indigenous person just to be there and just to kind of but to really explore. No, what was this conversation? What were these interactions like? And in particular, in Canada, in a moment where both peoples were being enslaved, what communities emerged, what relationships emerged from that?
Absolutely.
Because there were many, and they're not talked about. And I think that modern people, or people in our modern experiences, are we're talking about that ourselves. There's lots of conversations about BIPOC and all these terms are emerging. I think because people are thinking about those exact questions. What do we share? What don't we? What is our shared history? What opportunities do we have to make alliances and explore those and all of that? So,
Yep, absolutely. So, in what ways do you think your writing offers a unique perspective on the Canadian literary landscape, particularly with regards to Afro-Canadian voices and stories?
Yeah, I think it's the first book, or I don't want to. I gotta be careful because I'm not an expert on this either. I wrote the book and I read a lot, but I don't necessarily know enough to be going making statements. But it's certainly the first book that I've read that deals with Canadian slavery. It's one of a few books that offers a kind of nuanced portrayal of what these Underground Railroad communities, or what these communities in Canada were that emerged at the end of the Underground Railroad. And I think that was important because in Canada, in particular, we have the legacy of the Underground Railroad is that it represented, a kind of liberal Canadian ethic of taking pity on enslaved people fleeing the American South. And the reality is, while at that moment in time slavery had been abolished in Canada, Canada is not a utopic place. Was not a utopic place for Black folks, and there were plenty of challenges that people encountered here, or in Canada rather, and I think that deserves to be really recognized and shown in nuanced ways. And so, so I think in that respect, it's not that I'm the first to have done that necessarily, but it offers that in a literary landscape where there's not a ton of examples of books that really delve into those topics.
And speaking to that, your book does show us the political and social landscapes of Black Canada and all the Black migrants and the refugees that were and are a part of, that were there from the U.S. and Africa and even the West Indies.
Yeah.
And yet Black Canada rarely appears as often as I think it should in writings by authors of the African diaspora. Mm-hmm. Speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I actually think we're just kind of now entering this moment, where it feels like a real cultural, I don't know if renaissance is the right word, but, and maybe it's just me kind of entering the scene and paying attention to it in a new way. Right. That probably has a lot to do with it. Mm-hmm. But, I'm getting to now read, like what the Canadian Broadcast Company, CBC, is like putting out there in terms of Black Canadian authors. There's a number of films and books that are out now and that are being celebrated, I guess, in a new way. Mm-hmm. So I feel like it's coming, and it also, I think the lack of Black Canadian literature that you're alluding to is also in part is a demographics thing, Mm-hmm. I think it's coming for a number of reasons, but I think the reality is Canada, from a population standpoint, is so much smaller than the U.S. Mm-hmm. Within that, from a population standpoint, there's so many fewer Black folks in Canada than there are in the U.S., and we don't have the same type of cultural centers where, there's no New Orleans in Canada, there's no Atlanta in Canada. There aren't these centers where you have like critical mass of Black folks. Right. There are now neighborhoods and certain communities that have historical standing, especially in Nova Scotia and Southern Ontario to a certain degree, but the numbers and the kind of critical mass that you see really propelling a cultural production is we're just getting there, I think. So so that is a factor as well. And I think it's exciting, and I say that, and there's a rich legacy of Black Canadian writers and people generally, and I think part of what we'll hopefully continue to do is to shout out those who came before and really paved the way for us. Yeah, absolutely. So now this is your debut novel. Yeah. Do you have plans to write more, or is this going to be, are there any ideas you could share with us? Are you working on something currently, or you have ideas, or? Absolutely. I this was a beautiful experience for me, and it felt like, one of my callings for sure. And I'm not going to be a fast writer. I'm not going to be churning out books every year, 2 years. Right. I'll tell you that much. My family we just welcomed our second baby into the world.
Congratulations.
So now we got 2 under 2, and it's madness. Ooh, so yeah. I'm not gonna have the time to be, and I just work slowly. But anyways, all that said, yes, I am thinking and writing, and the very beginning stages of a book that will kind of be a sequel to this one. Yeah, it's not going to be like picking up where it left off necessarily, but it's going to be
same storyline, same timeline kind of thing.
Same world. Same time zones. This one is going to begin to a certain degree in Trinidad. We'll go to that part of the world. And, I'm really interested in exploring in Trinidad we have this rich kind of folklore, and is very dark and very nature based. I've been learning about it, and that is going to play central role in the next one.
Nice.
And I'll leave it at that for now because I don't
Okay.
even know how it's going to evolve. I have some ideas, but I don't want to speak too much because I'm like, well, it could change and evolve in ways
Completely turn left.
anticipate. But
Yeah.
those are some elements of what it'll kind of entail.
Okay.
So
Awesome.
yeah, that's what I'm working on.
Okay. So where can readers find your books?
You can find them. I mean, I encourage you to go straight from your local bookstore. They should be able to order them for you if they don't have in stock. And then if not, you can always go to the publisher's websites. And I actually recently got a website up and running. I don't have social media, but KaiThomasAuthor.com. That'll provide you with all the links.
Okay.
But yeah, I encourage people to go to check out your local bookstore and see if they can put together a book for you.
And of course, for my people listening out there, you know I'm going to push you to Resist Booksellers because they do have copies of In the Upper Country, and it's resistbooksellers.com, Black-owned, wonderful bookstore in Petersburg, Virginia. So definitely go online and grab it from there if you can. And you did say you're not on social media, but you have a website. Tell us that again.
KaiThomasAuthor.com.
Okay, and it's Kai, K-A-I, for everybody. Well, we have come to the end of our show. I want to thank you so much for sharing your time and talents, being here with me today. I truly, truly enjoyed the book. It's an absolutely wonderful read.
Thank you, Aja. Thanks so much for this wonderful conversation. I'm so glad we got to touch on all of these elements that I haven't really got to talk about yet. So I really appreciate it.
Good. I'm glad that I was able to bring up some, I always worry, that the questions, I always try to think of unique questions because I don't want authors to get tired. Like, here we go. It's going to answer the same questions all over again.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for being here. And Booze and Birds, you know how I do at the end of every show. I leave you with a quote. And today it comes from the late, great Nelson Mandela, also known as Madiba. And he said, "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." Until next time, you know what to do. Grab a book and read. And I'm out. Thank you for lending me your ear today. If you've enjoyed this independent podcast, you can help me continue to shine the light on Black authors and their stories by becoming a patron at patreon.com/betweenthereads or by giving a one-time gift at www.ko-fi.com/betweenthereadspodcast. That's ko-fi.com/betweenthereadspodcast. Tune in next time for another great episode.